Over the years, Watchtower has quoted scholars suggesting that the method by which Jesus died was on a stake. We will spend time to review Watchtower's sources, look at the post-New Testament writers, archaeological record, and scripture testimony to fact-check Watchtower and the cross.
We decided we're going to talk about the Watchtower and the cross and what history has shown, along with what Watchtower history has printed and published and said was doctrine. And we're just going to investigate what it all says together.
And we're going to give our perspective of how we view the scriptures on it in the history, and we hope you'll find it interesting. There's also something I learned about from Jason Zelda's channel. Prince was a Jehovah's Witness, and in one of the concerts on the Fox channel, he gives the Jehovah's Witness definition of Stauros, and what he says about it is interesting.
Stauros, by definition, a wooden stake driven in the ground used to cause torture or death. Stauros, perhaps someone lied about the way that someone died.
In the 1921 The Harp of God, written by Judge Rutherford, in the chapter on the ransom, they have a very nice woodcut of the cross. And I have a few different versions of the book. This drawing is in all of them. It was a few years later when Watchtower was trying to get rid of everything they considered to be pagan that they dropped the idea of the cross. In the first edition, you can see on the cover it says, "Proof conclusive that millions now living will never die." The later edition that I have, which was revised in the later 1920s, has on the cover a phrase stating the harmony of the 10 primary Bible teachings. There was also a pocket edition, and then there's a deluxe edition that has a nice embossed cover. I have almost the entire set of the embossed cover. I am missing one. It is a very nice looking set of books. I'll start with the Reasoning on the Scriptures book because they have a good little section in there on it. I was looking at this with a Jehovah's Witness I was studying with recently, and we decided together to take a look at the quotations that are here and look at them in their original context. So we were able to find the original source materials and take a look at it. What we found surprised us, or some of us, I should say. And it wasn't a surprise to me, but there are some other things that we found that will be very interesting as we get to it. So stay tuned, we'll get there. So in the Reasoning on the Scriptures book, there's some quotations in here.
Okay, now were these full quotations, or are they pull an excerpt out of what they like it said, and then there's context going elsewhere?
Well, you can see the ellipses in the quotation. So whenever there's an ellipsis, that's always a flag for me. Hey, I'm curious what isn't quoted.
Because when they were quoting the early Adventists on preaching to the entire world, they took a line, as in our previous discussion, they took a line out of it, and which did not say what the rest of the article above and below said it. So is that the same context in this?
Let's find out. Let's take a look. So the first quotation here, we have the Reasoning book on one side and the Imperial Bible Dictionary page on the other. So you can see both the original quote from Watchtower and you can see the original source where it's quoted from. One question that I asked the Jehovah's Witness was, well, why, when we look at this together, was, well, why did Watchtower leave out what the dictionary actually said? Why didn't they present
And that's a good
all?
point.
Yeah. Why didn't they present all sides of the issue like the dictionary did? They're only suggesting one view and not really looking at the entire quote. Well, what does the quote say? That's the most important thing. I don't think there's any question that he was hung on a Stauros. The question is, what is the Stauros? And so that's why this quotation from the Imperial Bible Dictionary is important, to see it in its context. The way that Watchtower is quoting it here makes it look like there's only one definition for the word, and that's how it was used pretty much for all time. But what does the dictionary say? The Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole, or a piece of paling on which anything might be hung, or which might be used in impaling or fencing in a piece of ground. But a modification was introduced as the dominion and usages of Rome extended themselves through Greek-speaking countries. Even amongst the Romans, the crux, from which the word cross is derived, appears to have been originally an upright pole and always remained the more prominent part. But from that time,
key word right there,
yeah,
part.
And this is, as you compare the reasoning book to this, you'll see what's being left out here. But from the time that it began to be used as an instrument of punishment, a traverse piece of wood was commonly added.
I'd like to add here, Jeff, that one, the whole point of saying he didn't die on a cross member, what was the whole point of them wanting to get that across anyway? It always seemed like a pointless argument when, one, everybody else knew otherwise, and two, why are they going at such a big deal to say he wasn't died on a cross, he was died on a tree? And it goes back to that Rutherford, we are different, we're getting rid of paganism, we're taking on something nobody else knows. And even when you go through, getting back, we'll regress, digress, and all that, when they marched Jesus through the streets, okay, the odds of him, after being beaten, whipped, tortured, starved, he was in a bad shape. Is it realistic he could have drug a pole of that size through the streets and up to Calgary, rather it being the more smaller cross member that was going to be attached to it?
I've seen a documentary on one of the Science channels or Discovery channels where they actually had a guy carry a full Stauros to see how far he could take it.
Yeah. Okay. Drag it a little bit. Can you drag it? I'll try. That's as far as I can go without hurting my shoulder. Okay, let's let it down. And ribs. This impossible? No way. It's really, really heavy. I mean, it will break your shoulder. You will feel heavier and heavier and heavier. 400 yards? No. Maybe in heaven. Bend down a little bit. Okay. Okay.
You have to keep in mind that patibulum was originally a word used to describe a yoke that you would tie people to and humiliate them in a public square.
That's the tradition that it comes out of.
Ready for the weight?
Is it centered? Okay.
You got it.
Let me see.
Center. You're stepping away.
Yeah, it is centered. Okay.
Jonathan has laid out a quarter-mile course for Hayati to walk with the patibulum. Spotters on either side will take the load if anything goes wrong.
How do you feel?
Feel all right. A little tension on my wrist, on my hands.
Within 75 yards, the weight of the patibulum takes its toll.
How are you doing now? My arms are really hurting. Really hurting now? And I feel the pain on my back. Uphill is very hard.
It's your call, but give us a warning when you want to.
Yeah.
Downhill is, in fact, not easier.
Oh, down the hill it's like pushing me down, trying to stop it. Yeah, okay. You guys? We got it.
Less than 150 yards into the march, Hayati gives out.
I was surprised actually how far he was able to carry that. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there would have been a beating beforehand that I'm sure would have cut down on how far you would have been able to carry it.
The dictionary continues. It says, There can be no doubt, however, that the latter sort was the more common, the Stauros with the crossbeam on it.
Hang on one second, Jeff. I'm trying to follow along in the reasoning book, and I don't see that part in there.
It is not there. That's one of
It's
the ellipses. So.
now, wouldn't you say what you just read was one of the most key important elements out of the dictionary that they took the quotation from?
I'll
No
repeat again.
doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Watchtower was trying to get rid of everything pagan. I can understand what they were trying to do. And yes, there are pagans who use the symbol of the Stauros, the symbol of the cross, as an object of worship. There are even Christian
And
denominations.
Rutherford used it in the Watchtower himself, the symbol.
Yes, you could see it in,
Yeah,
well,
and again, like,
Russell, Rutherford, all the early Watchtower literature had the cross. They even had the cross and the crown. Another subject for another time, but it also says that it may be added that crucifixion was abolished around the time of Constantine, and it was in consequence of what associations that Constantine had with the cross. And we'll get into that subject as well very soon.
now,
Stay tuned.
for those who might be Jehovah's Witnesses looking at this in disagreement, again, a reminder, we took the quote directly from where the Watchtower in the reasoning book quoted it. So it's not, there's nothing of us twisting words or trying to make anything seem something that it's not. We're just pointing out what the book actually said.
That's a good point, Paul, and a very good point.
Yeah. Coincidentally, I didn't plan this, but here's my cross cup.
So this J.D. Parson that's being quoted about the pagan origins of the cross, this quotation comes from a book called Our Sun God, not S-O-N, but S-U-N, as you can see on the screen. He wasn't trying to prove the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament was Jesus, but there was some kind of new sun god that they were trying to bring in. And his whole point about the paganism of the cross, he was trying to make Jesus' history associated with the paganism. So it's very interesting that Watchtower would use that source as one of their evidences, because it proves exactly the opposite of what they're trying to get across.
Well, something interesting too. Back then, before the internet and all that, they could look very impressive quoting these old historical books that weren't around the corner in your town library. You'd have to travel, New York City, Chicago, a large city to get and see an original copy of something. And even those you couldn't check out. They were more like reference and whatnot. So this stuff could not be fact checked or taken from people looking, hey, wait, this wasn't the context. And you notice today, the Watchtower does less and less of this and more towards simple. Look at the animals, look at the picture, because people can fact check everything today. So with this, again, now people over the years have scanned them into files, to PDFs, that we have access to stuff, and we can now dissect this and say, hey, that's not what, like we're doing now, that's not what that book said. That's not what that book was about.
Yeah, I always try and, when I'm reading something, it doesn't matter if it's from Watchtower or wherever, I always try and fact check, go to the original source material and see what else is said in context, because sometimes it might add more evidence for what the author is trying to propose by quoting it. Other times it might be exactly the opposite, as in this case. So
And
it's always good.
Do that
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, now we can. The reasoning book is quoting from the Liddell and Scott's Greek-English lexicon. And it doesn't really prove anything either way, because the lexicon does use the word cross. And it even describes it as a collar of wood put on the neck of a prisoner. That would be a crossbeam.
Mm-hmm.
So if it related to a crucifixion, the arms would be outward with a crossbeam like that, then upward, right? So
now, why do you think they allowed that slip in there? I think at times they decide, hey, we need to write a new book. Hey, you work on this, you work on that, you work on that. Somebody other than the governing body puts it together as the final editor and misses stuff. They like what this says, but oh, ooh, that got through. I mean, they print them out so fast, at least back then when they were selling books before the internet. Because that's sometimes they have allowed those slips in there without, and it seems like they couldn't have realized it or made a mistake.
And I think part of the problem also is that they want to present just one side of the story. Their side of the story, instead of saying, well, the scholars have 2 or 3 different views, right? Here's the different views that the scholars have. This is good for these reasons, but on the other hand, view 2 is good for these reasons, but on the other hand, we like view 3, something like that.
This is their own counter argument right in their own print, which is odd.
Yeah.
So now that I've said my thing, what's your thought on why something like this would be slipped into the reasoning book or slipped through?
So I think a lot of it is just they want to present one side of the issue. And because they have avoided higher education and critical thinking skills based on that higher education, I think sometimes when they're researching these things, they don't realize that when you quote from a source like that, you've got to present what the sources, the various views from that source. Don't quote it as if the source only had one view. And that's just not the way that critical scholarship is handled, right? So because of their lack of education, because they want to present only one view, I think limits them in how they use these sources. So another quote that they have is from the Companion Bible. I actually have multiple copies of these because I use this Bible so often that I happen to wear them out. The one that I use that has a lot of my notes in it lost its cover. I had it rebound and it lost its cover again. So it does wear out. But this is the King James Bible. I happen to have all the scriptures in my head memorized in King James because that's what I was raised with. But if I can't find the scripture, I'll look it up in King James and then I'll just switch over to one of the other translations and compare. But anyway, what's interesting about the Companion Bible is you'll have a column of the translation there, and then the next column over has the notes. So it's notes on the Greek, the Hebrew, the grammar, and in the back are multiple appendixes on various subjects. And so as you can see on this slide here, Appendix 162 in the Companion Bible is on the cross and crucifixion. How is Bullinger coming to his opinion? He's not basing it on the Greek, on the Septuagint, on these things. He's basing it on the Greek classics. So he's citing Xenophon and Thucydides. They lived in the 4th and 5th century BC. At that time, Stauros was just an upright pole. There's no question about
Based
that.
on what we just showed you.
Right. From the other dictionary.
Exactly.
And so it's later that upright pole gets the crossbeam. So Bullinger's pointing to the wrong period of time to try and prove his point. So while Bullinger does state there's nothing in the Greek of the New Testament even to imply 2 pieces of a timber, he goes on to explain that in the early church, the Chi-Rho or the Chi, it had 4 arms, 4 crossbeams. So he's arguing against crossbeams by looking at the 4th and 5th century BC, and then says when the early Christians used it, it had multiple crossbeams. So I think it's a counter argument to what he's actually trying to get across. And I think it, again, illustrates the point that we're showing that the Stauros had a crossbeam at the time of Christ.
And once again, I didn't notice it or mention it. I didn't mention it earlier. how the Romans did it. I've been to Israel, Jerusalem, Italy, Rome. I've been around where the ancient Romans were in the world and personally seen some of these artifacts and historical in museums where they were blocks of stone with a pocket, a square pocket drilled in, or a round pocket drilled in. And what would happen at these sites is basically they'd impale the person to it and then put it in the pocket and lift it up, both with people pushing and ropes, and then it slid and fell in the pocket, which that must have hurt jarring. You're
Yeah.
hanging, and then that thing finally lets loose and falls into the pocket.
That would
So,
pull your bones out of joint. And that's what it said in Psalms 22, the prophecy about Jesus' crucifixion. It says in the psalm, all my bones are out of joint.
good point to add to this discussion, Jeff. Excellent point.
That psalm, that's the psalm Jesus quotes from the cross when he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the first verse of that psalm.
And so what they like, they put the Stauros there. They then what Jesus or whoever carried with them to it, they then impaled upon the Stauros and then rose it. Again, why did they have to make this so difficult? Once again, we got to be different. We don't celebrate birthdays. We have the true religion. We don't celebrate Christmas. That's pagan. We have the true religion. And then look at this. Oh, that came from pagan, from Egypt, sun god. That's pagan. We don't do that. So I think this one is one of the ones where they probably, in hindsight, if they researched a little bit better, they probably wouldn't have made this as big of an issue. Who knows? But
why do you think that Watchtower was trying to rid itself of all its pagan ideas and pagan concepts?
Well, as you and I have discussed privately, outside of these discussions, a lot of it has to do with Rutherford believing he can wipe out pagan practices. When you boil it all down, he fought the dragon, as we've discussed in other conversations. So
another discussion for
another
another
discussion.
time.
I think the people like that discussion. So
That's going to be an interesting one.
that'll be an interesting one. Using
right.
history, once again, using history and documentation, not words off the top of our head.
We're at such point now where we can point back to the discussions and use clips and also point forward. I think it adds to the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So the letter Chi, the initial words of Christ, originally used for his name, this was superseded by symbols in some of the earlier manuscripts. And even in these, it had 4 arms or a crossbeam in it as well. On the other hand, crosses were used in pagan worship. They were used as symbols of the Babylonian sun god. They were seen on the coins of Julius Caesar, even Augustus Caesar as well. And those were all BC dates. On Constantine's coins, and I have some of these.
The real.
Yeah, the real deal.
Good, cool.
Here's a coin of Constantine the Great. You can actually see his head on there. I have a lot of these coins. Some of these are in better shape than the others.
Jeff, you have the most unique religious, historical type collections of anyone I know. Been touched by human hands in 2,000 years.
And Jeff's got his fingers all over it.
Well, it's funny that we're talking about this. I remember once again when the Jehovah's Witnesses or Rutherford while they were appeasing Hitler, they were also working against the Nazi symbol, saying that was a variant of the cross, where they said Hitler bent the arms of the wheel or whatever you want to call it into the shape of the Nazis.
Well, that symbol is actually a very ancient symbol.
It was before the Nazis, but I remember, I don't want to go 100%, but I strictly remember them implying that it was like a unique Nazi thing based on the cross.
There are some very good archaeological museums in the world. I've been to the British Library, the British Museum, of course. But here in our Chicago area, they have the Oriental Institute. And if you know the fictional character Indiana Jones, this was the university he went to while in United States, while at home, to learn archaeology. At the Oriental Institute here, when you go through some of that ancient history, you'll see some of those bent crosses on some of those early, pre-BC dates. That symbol goes way, way back. Here's a definition from some recent scholarship. The New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, Volume 1, and Colin Brown is the editor. This is the fourth printing, 1979 edition. On page 391, it says, the exact technical form and significance of execution are not conveyed by the words Stauros, and without further definition. In order to determine this, it is necessary to know in what region and under what authority the execution was carried out. It is also necessary to know the standpoint of the writer who uses these terms. There appears to be a fundamental difference between the East and the West over the question of execution and its means. In the East, there was the practice of hanging and impaling bodies, which were sometimes decapitated. This was an additional penalty. By being exhibited, the person executed was put to further shame. This form of punishment was rejected in the West and not practiced. Hanging or fastening in some way to a stake, beam, or cross was a means of execution of someone still alive. A distinction must, however, be drawn between the various modes of execution. And then a little bit further down it says, it is certain only that the Romans practiced this form of execution, but it is most likely that the Stauros had a traverse in the form of a crossbeam. Secular sources do not permit any conclusion to be drawn as to the precise form of the cross, as to whether it was the cross emissa, a plus sign, or the cross commissa, a T. As it was not very common to affix a titulos, a superscription, a loan word from the Latin titulus, it does not necessarily follow that the cross had the form of a crux emissa, or the plus sign. It was probably more the form of a capital T. If it was a capital T, there would have been no room to place the sign over Jesus' head, so his would have had to been with the crossbeam a little further down. So this is the Awake from November 22nd, 1976. Has an article entitled, Does Christianity Have a Visible Symbol? And it mentions a quotation from the early Christian church, a gentleman named Justin Martyr. And it says, moreover, Justin Martyr, writing 1 full century prior to the time that Vines assigns to the adoption of the cross into Christianity, expressly states that Jesus was crucified upon a cross, contrary to what the Awake's quotation here is saying, which he goes on to describe for us. For the one beam is placed upright, from which the highest extremity is raised up into a horn, while the other beam is fitted onto it, and the ends appear on both sides as horns joined onto the one horn. Justin Martyr was an early Christian writer, and he's describing the Stauros on which Jesus died as a cross. So while Justin Martyr isn't inspired, he is really early, about a half century after the death of John. It really shows that even that those early Christians who knew the apostles, who lived close to that period of time, saw that symbol as a cross, contrary to how the Awake magazine's quoting it here.
It's like they had the luxury back then to be the fact checkers, because they were getting the information, and people just took they got it from that book. Oh wow, I didn't know that. It's amazing what the world hides from us. And once again, they come out looking like they truly fact checked something to its original content. When now, in this day and age, we can fact the fact checker and come up with other conclusions of the context and what was really being said.
Well, just to support the awake here, at least they say that this quotation indicates Justin himself believed that Jesus died on a cross.
However,
And that's where they go. They then try to argue the point.
and then
Well, why? Because they see there are some pagan associations with that symbol, right?
he wasn't inspired by God. He was a century later. What would he know? He didn't witness the event. So what they did actually was they brought what a counter argument to the table just so they could destroy it. And what did they use? Once again, he wasn't there. How would he know? He was pagan. So there's a lot of underlying psychology into all the methods of how things are written.
I have an easy question for you, Paul. Who killed Jesus?
Technically, or at that moment, or technically Satan killed him. You want to say Satan killed him, the Romans killed him, the Jews killed him.
Okay, the Romans. Weren't Romans pagan?
Exactly.
Why wouldn't pagans use a pagan symbol?
Exactly. That's the beauty of it. And
So,
as we get into the discussion, we're going to show the origin of the cross with Judaism.